Welcome to the Dark Nook Monster Shop. So I went to Bill Making Stuff's page and got the Big Bot Bash Junk Bot Generator. I rolled the dice and my results were so good I couldn't not make this. Right off the bat, death and bones for the head and body, and flavor, killing machine.
It's like, I was made for this.
This one's gonna be fun. Let's see. Death and bones. Well, I got that covered. I got these dollar store skeletons for parts. Using skeletons for robot parts. That reminds me of a movie. Remember the movie Virus from back in the 90s? Jamie Lee Curtis, Donald Sutherland, and one of the other bald ones? It was a fun little body horror flick where this alien AI takes over a Navy ship and uses the crew as spare parts to make these Frankenstein cyborg robots. Some great practical effects in that flick. I highly recommend it. So first things first, I need to break these skeletons down. I start by gaslighting them and convincing them they're crazy. Then I unscrew them. The slightly higher quality skeletons are held together with screws. The cheap ones are just press fit together and glued. Now these screw holes will be useful later for reattaching some of these parts with wire. But before I can do any of that, I have to figure out the basic shape for this monster. Now the movie and the comic book both take place on a Navy ship. This alien AI takes over the machine shop and starts making these Franken-cyborg monsters with pieces and material harvested from the crew. So I'm going with the idea that the AI bots raided the galley on this ship, and there was a few sides of beef, maybe a few whole pigs in the freezer. And this thing can use any animal parts it finds, not just parts from people. It can reassemble and repurpose pretty much any biological material. So this was once the ship's cook. Now he's been combined with parts from the kitchen machinery and whatever animals were in the big walk-in freezer. But this cook's job hasn't changed that much. He's still butchering meat. His job is to go out and hunt down any specific parts that the AI needs and bring those ingredients back with minimal damage for use in making other meat bots. I just test fit these parts and play with the shapes a bit until I find a configuration that I like. Then I glue it together with hot glue. And I know what you're saying, hot glue, but it's gonna look all gloopy and stringy. Yeah, it is. And that's okay. And hey, if it's hot glue and I don't like the way it looks, I can always just hit it with a heat gun, pull it apart, and try again. But that won't be necessary because I already like where this one's going. I used some of the cog and gear molds I got off Amazon to make some little mechanical looking greeblies. These were like $10 and they work great with foam clay, but they do have to sit and dry for about a day. So I go back to making the body and decide to add a tail, or I guess it's really more of a tentacle. I guess a butt tentacle. I guess that's all a tail really is, a butt tentacle. Never really thought of it that way. Another great use for foam clay. I just roll out a flat noodle of foam clay with a bottle cap to impart the texture from the edge of the bottle cap. This works great for mechanical looking paneling that has that machined pattern look to it like it's been knurled. After a day or so of drying, the foam clay is ready to be pulled out of the molds. It's also ready to be pulled out of the random bits of plastic packaging that I've used to make metal plates and panels. The bubble wrapping on the outside of a lot of packaging is great for making thin foam clay pieces look like symmetrical armor or molded plates. I wrap the skull in plastic and secure it with a twist tie, so I can sculpt some foam clay bits over the top and they'll be molded to the contours of the face, but I'll be able to remove them and glue them back on later. I set that aside to dry and start on the robot parts. I'm using a piece from an air freshener pod thing. I think it looks kind of like the top of a big industrial mixer, so it fits with the theme. I add a little foam ring to the piece and set it aside to dry too. The next day, I peel the bits off the plastic wrapped skull and set them aside. Now I flip this piece from the mouth over and glue it into place to make the roof of the mouth. Isn't that clever? Then I glue the bottom jaw back onto the skull, but I give him a nice wide open mouth screaming pose. Now these dragon wings are perfect for making big creepy long pointy fingered hands, but they have to be reconfigured. Each finger has to be cut off and then glued back on in a new position. I use floral wire, a lot like a tendon, to secure each new finger back to the wrist. This is a bit tedious, but the results look awesome, and they're pretty strong. I add a foam gear from the mold to the bottom of the skull, and glue the skull in position to the crooked, weird-looking neck. Then once the hands are done, I run some thicker wire through the screw hole and secure it to the rest of the skeleton. I also add some little electrical wiring bits to look like metal machine parts later when I paint it. Then I add more of these electrical wiring bits to make robot-looking greebly parts. I also use some little screws and rivets to make robot eyes and cameras and other assorted sensory doodads. Next, I add more bits to what I'm calling the robot head. The human head with a skull is just for sensory input. The robot head is the real boss. I want it to look almost like there's an R2-D2 style droid piloting this meat machine from its back. So I glue on a bunch of little bits to add interesting robot shapes and mechanical textures. It looks goofy now, but once it's primed and all the shapes kind of merge together, it'll look awesome, and that process is very satisfying. And don't pay attention to all that red crap. I cut all that off later. But first, more bits on the skull. I poke a rivet through the bit of foam I sculpted earlier and glue that to the skull. I glue more and more bits to the skull to give it more and more of a robot look. But let's not forget the rest of the body. I think I'll follow the idea of him being made from kitchen equipment and add some boxy looking bits that could be part of a fridge or a big appliance, some industrial mixer. I use a spin click switch for this, since each half will be symmetrical. It'll look all the more mechanical. I also glue on some of the foam clay pieces I've made to look like metal plates. Next, I glue a little zip tie to the back of each finger just to add an additional mechanical look. I'm going to cover these in clay later, so you're really not going to see much of this. I also add in some pieces of wood kebab skewer to make some pistons for the legs. Then I replace all that red crap with a snap. And it's time for some paint. I start with a black base coat. Then, once that's dry, I brush on a dark bone color over the skeleton parts. Then I use a lighter color bone white for the highlights and for the teeth. When that's all dry, I glue on a few more pieces for the mechanical parts that would have been hard to paint behind. And then I paint all the robot parts with another coat of black. Now it's time for guts and muscle tissue. I make foam clay paste by mixing a piece of red foam clay and some Mod Podge. Then I paint the gloopy mixture all around the parts of the skeleton where I want there to be muscle on the bones, or a muscly, tissuey transition between robot parts and skeleton parts. I don't cover all the bone parts, but I do cover a lot of it, being sure to leave some bone showing through though. The really cool thing about this stuff, the Mod Podge causes the surface to dry and skin over in just a few minutes, while it's still soft and wet underneath, so you can smush it around and texture it to look really cool. Once that's all good and dry, I cover the whole thing in a purple wash. Next, I pull apart some red yarn and some blue yarn. I pull it apart and then pull it apart again until it's completely frayed out into its smallest threads. And once I'm left with a big frizzy pile of red and blue yarn fibers, I grab a hunk of flesh-toned clay and work the yarn into the clay. I mush it all together and set it aside. I take a bit of the foam paste that dried inside its container, peel it off, and use it to create this weird-looking thin suspended strip of muscle. And once I've glued that in place, then I take some of the clay and add skin over the top. And the cool thing about this clay is I can shape and pull and work the clay because the yarn works to hold it together. And once I've put the clay down onto a surface, I can shape it, texture it, even rip holes in it. I add exaggerated wrinkles before smoothing it with a brush dipped in water and Mod Podge. I glue some bits of yarn down to act as supports for a piece of clay. I just kind of want it hanging over the chest, so I stick the clay to the yarn bits, shape it around them a little bit, while giving it some texture and some small holes to really give it that extra creepy factor. I lay some skin down over a lot of the body, but like with the goopy layer before, I make sure not to cover all the muscle from the last step or the bone from the original skeleton. So you end up getting layers of skin and muscle and bone. And now last, for the hands, I add some skin. I add clay to the fingers, and then I dip my fingers in water and smooth the clay over the fingers until it's nice and flat and flush and scraped away entirely in some places. Once that's all dry, another purple wash. And a quick little touch up on the teeth, because I've painted over them. And now, we finally make the metal parts look metal. I brush all the metal bits with metallic steel. Then, I paint some of the metal parts green, still going with that like industrial kitchen mixer or slicer being used for parts. And for a little last touch and a bit of fun, I roll up some pink foam clay into a tube with a length of frayed red yarn and frayed blue yarn to make intestines. I wet my hands and roll out a long tube that I cut into pieces and shape into intestine hoses. This thing isn't just using the bones and the muscle, it's using your guts for tubing. I then wash the intestines in a reddish pink wash. Once they're dry, I glue the new intestine hoses into place. Then I add a few more small details on the big red robot eyes and a final brown burnt sienna wash with the airbrush. When that's dry, I put some UV resin on all the goopy and wet bits of guts and stuff, and then I cure it with a UV light. And finally, a few little touches of silver for scratches and chips. And with that, we're done with the Meatbot killing machine. Now, on to the beauty shots. Thanks for checking out my video. Please hit like and subscribe to the Monster Shop for more creepy creatures and crafty creations. And thanks to Bill Making Stuff for doing the Big Bot Bash. This was fun. I found a lot of new creators that wouldn't have otherwise shown up in my feed, so I really appreciate it.